In controlled interaction studies conducted in conflict resolution laboratories, researchers observed a consistent pattern. When one participant stops responding without exiting the exchange, the other participant's verbal output increases significantly within seconds. Heart rate variability and speech elaboration both rise despite no new information being introduced. The absence of response itself becomes the variable shaping behavior. Heart rate variability shifted, speech became more elaborate, attempts at justification intensified even in the absence of new input. There was no insult, no argument, only silence. Yet the nervous system responded as if pressure had been applied. This led psychologists to a precise question. If communication is defined by information exchange, why does the absence of information feel like an active force? What exactly is happening when nothing is being said, but everything in the interaction changes? This phenomenon is studied under what social psychologists describe as strategic silence and non-reciprocal interaction dynamics. At its core, silence is not absence of communication. It is the removal of expected feedback loops in social cognition. Humans calibrate behavior continuously based on verbal and nonverbal reinforcement. When that reinforcement disappears, the system destabilizes. Robert Cialdini's work on influence highlights a foundational principle. Behavior is shaped by response patterns, not isolated actions. Silence interrupts that pattern entirely. By the end of this analysis, you will not interpret silence as emptiness. You will recognize it as a structural shift in control dynamics within human interaction. Not what is said, what is withheld, and more importantly, what that withholding triggers in others. In observational studies of interpersonal negotiation, researchers noted a consistent phenomenon. When one party stops responding, the other party unconsciously increases communicative output. They repeat themselves, they clarify, they over-explain. Nothing new is requested, yet behavior escalates. This is not confusion. It is cognitive recalibration under uncertainty. The human brain treats response absence as unresolved social tension, not neutrality. Detection tool. When silence is introduced mid-interaction, observe who begins to fill the gap. The one who speaks more is often the one losing informational control. This leads to a deeper layer. Silence does not remove influence. It redirects it internally. When verbal feedback stops, individuals begin simulating the absent response internally. What are they thinking? Replaces actual dialogue. This engages predictive cognition systems associated with theory of mind processing in the medial prefrontal cortex. The result is not calm. It is internal dialogue escalation. Silence forces the mind to become its own audience and its own critic. Detection tool. In conversations, notice when silence causes the other person to self-justify without prompting. That is not persuasion happening externally. That is persuasion being self-generated. This dynamic begins to resemble control without action, which introduces the next layer. In behavioral psychology, reinforcement schedules determine how behavior stabilizes. Silence functions as the removal of intermittent reinforcement. No acknowledgement, no correction, no validation. This creates prediction instability. The nervous system interprets this as social uncertainty, increasing attentional focus on the silent individual. Attention follows uncertainty more reliably than interest. Detection tool. When someone becomes unusually attentive to a silent individual, it is often not connection. It is unresolved predictive tension. This is where silence begins to function as pressure, not absence. And yet, interpretation becomes more complicated at this stage. Silence does not exist in isolation. It is interpreted through the relationship history between individuals. In high-trust environments, silence can signal comfort. In unstable dynamics, it signals withdrawal or judgment. The same absence of speech produces different psychological outputs depending on context. This is where naive interpretation fails. Silence is not a behavior. It is a variable interpreted through emotional memory. Detection tool. Never evaluate silence alone. Evaluate silence relative to prior interaction patterns. Behavioral meaning is historical, not isolated. This leads directly into a critical misunderstanding in most surface-level analysis. But here is where it becomes more complex. Experimental findings in conflict psychology show that silence is not always perceived as dominance by the receiver. In some cases, prolonged silence increases perceived uncertainty so much that individuals attribute false intent to it, hostility, disapproval, or manipulation where none exists. In other words, silence does not contain meaning itself. It forces meaning creation in the observer. The mind prefers a false explanation over no explanation at all. This means silence is not inherently manipulative, but it is structurally susceptible to being interpreted as manipulation. And that distinction changes everything. Because now the focus is no longer on silence itself, but on the interpretive systems of the observer. In applied social dynamics, silence is often misidentified as passive behavior. In reality, it can function as indirect control only when the other party is highly dependent on feedback. Dependency amplifies silence into influence. Independence neutralizes it. Control is not in the silence. It is in the psychological dependence on response. Detection tool. If silence alters your emotional state significantly, the signal is not about them. It is about your reliance on their feedback loop. At this level, silence is no longer interpersonal. It is intrapersonal exposure, which leads into the broader implication. If silence consistently forces cognitive and emotional recalibration, then human interaction is not purely verbal exchange. It is a continuous regulation of expectation, uncertainty, and perceived social alignment. Silence reveals how unstable internal interpretation can become when external validation is removed. And more importantly, it reveals how much of perceived social reality depends on response timing rather than actual content. If meaning collapses or intensifies based on absence of speech, then much of what is believed about intention, clarity, and emotional certainty may be more fragile than assumed. Not because people are deceptive, but because interpretation is constantly being reconstructed in real time. Now that the mechanism is visible, application becomes structural. First, observe your own reaction latency. If silence creates immediate emotional escalation, it indicates dependence on external feedback loops. Second, distinguish between silence as context and silence as interactional shift. Only the latter carries relational significance. Third, track who fills silence consistently in your interactions. That pattern reveals more about perceived control than speech ever will. Most people do not lose control through what is said to them. They lose it through what is not said and how quickly they attempt to replace it. The final reframing is this: silence is not the absence of communication. It is the removal of structure that forces the mind to reveal how it constructs meaning. Next, the analysis moves into how subtle timing differences in conversation reveal intention long before words do, and why most people never notice it happening.